Hello everyone, welcome to the video for chapter 3. This video is all about engines. So when we look at aircraft engines, they tend to be pretty low-tech, if you will. You might look at that engine and go, hey, why is this using 1930s technology? Well, the answer is very simple. It works, it's reliable, and that's the biggest thing. We are all about reliability. Not necessarily most efficient, but we'll take reliability over efficiency any day, especially when we're up in the air. So for the most part, you're going to have air-cooled engines. And they're usually horizontally opposed and four-stroke. What does horizontally opposed mean? If you look at the cylinders, there's 2 or 3 cylinders poking out on one side, and directly opposite there's another 2 or 3 cylinders. It's not a V configuration like you might find in your car. Your car engine is definitely going to be water cooled. Why is that? Water cooling is a little bit easier to do. It's more efficient. You can have tighter tolerances in that engine than with air cooled, because you have to allow for more expansion and contraction because the variation in temperatures can be much greater. Why don't we use water cooled in airplanes much? It's heavier and it's more stuff to break. That's why. So pretty much air cooled, opposed, and 4-stroke. Now there are some experimental aircraft out there that have 2-stroke engines, but that's not the norm. Okay, 4-stroke engines, real quickly, what are the 4 strokes? If you have a cylinder, and here you have a piston in that cylinder, it goes down. This is the first part of those 4 strokes, and this is what they call the intake stroke. So this is my intake valve, and this is where it sucks in fuel and air. Then after I intake, I have to squeeze it. I have my compression stroke. So on the compression stroke, the valves are closed. The piston moves up, and it's going to compress my fuel-air mixture. Then I have my spark. So my spark fires, and then I have my power stroke. So that spark fires, or actually in our case of our engines, we have dual spark plugs. So the spark fires. Here's my little spark. And now I have this fuel air mixture exploding, pushing down on my piston. So this is my power stroke. By the way, if you become an aviation mechanic, they don't talk about 4-stroke engines, they talk about 5 events, where they intake, compress, spark, power, and then they exhaust. So what happens after this is the piston's going to go back up, and now this valve, which is my exhaust valve, is going to be open. And my gas is going to go out. So that stuff is going to go out my exhaust. Or some people would say suck, squeeze, spark, bang, and blow. That's another way of describing these 5 events. All right, so that is the 4 strokes in a 4-stroke engine. Let's talk about ignition systems. An ignition system, there's 2 of them. There's 2 spark plugs per cylinder, and we have 2 ignition systems. So we use something called a magneto. So a magneto is very different from what you have on your car. It's more like what you have on your lawnmower, which should make you feel nice and safe. So what's a magneto do? A magneto is a self-contained ignition system. It will create high voltage and it will distribute that high voltage. So in your car you have things like an alternator, and then you have a coil that's going to create high voltage from the lower voltage, and then you have a distributor. The magneto has all this stuff built in together. So if you look at the ignition key in your plane, it usually looks something like this: off, and then it's going to say right, left, both, and many aircraft will also say start. Now if you're training on the Flying Club's old Cessna, it actually doesn't have a start position, but that's, for another day, that story. Anyway, so you have a key where you can select either one magneto or another, or both. So normally we run them with both because 2 sparks per cylinder is more efficient. We would only run them on one or the other when one of the magnetos has failed. If one of the magnetos has failed and it's kind of sometimes firing and sometimes not, that can lead to some pretty rough running engines, and you would go with one magneto or the other. So before you take off, during your run up, you will actually put it on a certain RPMs, and then you will click, usually 2 clicks to the right magneto, and then watch the drop in RPMs from the less efficient engine, go back to both, 1 click onto the left magneto, then back to both. By the way, you might say, why would I do 2 clicks and then both and 1 click? That's a tip I got long ago from my flight instructor. And the reason for doing it this way is that you're less likely to accidentally leave it on one magneto. The people that go 1 click, both, 2 clicks, both, sometimes go 1 click to left, back to both, 2 clicks to the right, and then back to the left, not all the way back to both. So, little tip there. Okay, so that's what a magneto does. You have 2 spark plugs per cylinder. Half of the spark plugs are connected to one magneto, half the other, right? So what do? Half of the bottom plugs are connected to each magneto. Half of the top plugs are also connected to each magneto. Why do you care about that? There's a couple reasons. If you don't lean out your engine mixture properly, you can accumulate lead and other crud in your spark plugs. You can foul them. If that happens, it tends to mostly affect the bottom plugs. That's where all that crap is going to accumulate. And that's really bad. So for the starting process, if those bottom plugs are fouled, you might have a hard time starting. Well, why is that? Your engine actually only starts on the left magneto. Okay? Why would that be? Well, here's why that is. Because the left magneto is usually the one that has an impulse coupling. And what does that do? Rod describes this in the book. What that does is two things. This delays the spark. If you look at the ignition systems in your airplane, it's very simple. It is a fixed timing ignition system. What does that mean? You know, we talked about the 4 strokes. We said you compress the stuff and then there's the spark. Now, that's the idealized situation. In the real world, if you've got that engine turning at a certain RPM, those pistons are going up and down, you want that spark to hit before you get to top dead center, right? Because you want to be traveling upward, ignite that so that that explosion, if you will, travels down to the piston and it pushes it down, right? If you went at top dead center, it's coming up and you explode it and it's already pulling away because the other cylinders are pulling it away. It's not as efficient when you're going quickly. It's pretty common to have about a 25-degree before top dead center timing. You know, if you look at an engine, there's a data plate on the engine. It'll tell you what the timing is for that engine. So we have a delayed spark. When the engine is turning very slowly, as we're trying to start it, we want that to happen pretty much at the top dead center point. So we delay the spark and we get a hotter spark. And how does that work? You basically wind up a spring. So if you turn a prop by hand, you'll hear a little clicking noise. That is the impulse coupler that you're hearing. So as it turns, if it's turning slowly, it winds up the spring, and right when it gets to top dead center, so 25 degrees later or so, from where it would normally fire, it goes, I wound up enough, and then boom, it releases. And what happens when it releases all that built up tension, and it spins the magneto very fast. Spinning it faster gives you a hotter spark, gives you higher voltage. So if you have an engine that won't start, look at your bottom plugs. Are they fouled? Maybe. Now, if the left magneto goes bad with this impulse coupler, you'll end up with an engine that just won't start for nothing. Right? You can grind away at that thing all day long and it's not going to start. So that's the ignition system in an aircraft engine. All right, let's talk real quickly about induction systems. So we need to get fuel-air mixture into our engine. How do you do that? Well, you can either have a fuel-injected engine, which some aircraft do. You know, if you look at the Lance that I did a pre-flight in for Chapter 1, it's got a fuel-injected engine. If you look at the old Cessna, it has a carbureted engine. Slightly different technologies. Either way, your throttle, the little lever in the cockpit, is going to be connected to something kind of like this, a little butterfly valve. So this is a cylinder, you got air going through here, I should say fuel air mixture going through here. And as I open the throttle, it will tilt this valve. As I close the throttle, it will close this valve. Biggest thing you need to know about when you're flying an aircraft with a carburetor especially is that you can get carburetor icing. So how does that happen? It can happen in a lot of different conditions. If there's high humidity, you can get carburetor icing. High humidity, low power settings are more likely to cause this, and here's why. If I have my throttle close to idle, there's just a very tiny gap here for this fuel-air mixture to go into. By the way, most of the time these carburetors are on the bottom of the engine. It's not like a car. Well, a lot of your cars probably don't have carburetors, but if you have an older car has a carburetor, it's usually on the top. But in aircraft engines, we put them on the bottom and it's an upflow carburetor. So there's a teeny tiny gap here. So let's say that there's a lot of moisture. As this fuel-air mixture goes through this little gap, it gets cooled. You're going through a teeny tiny space and it's expanding out on the other side. And that's a cooling process. So what happens when you cool stuff? Well, if there's moisture in there, it can start to freeze. And next thing you know, there's like no space here. And all of a sudden, you're not getting full power, right? Now, you can actually get to a place where if you even have full power, you've got ice building up on either side of this throttle plate, this butterfly valve. How do you fix that? You apply carburetor heat. What's carburetor heat? It's very simple. Instead of having air coming in from the front of the engine through the air filter, they suck in air that has gone around the exhaust. So if you look at an engine, you'll see these shrouds, usually one on each side. One side is for cabin heat. So if it's the winter time and you're cold, you can get cabin heat where you have a shroud around the exhaust and it sucks in air and then heats it up from being by the hot exhaust pipes, and then it puts it into the cabin. And then the other side will have a carburetor heater. So if you're in a situation where you could have carburetor icing, you'll turn on the carburetor heat. So in the old Cessna, you'll put on carburetor heat every time you come into land because you're at low power settings. It's more likely that you're going to get carburetor icing, and it's also more likely that you're not going to notice it until you try to put in some power, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, this is bad. Okay. When it comes to cabin heat, by the way, something you have to worry about is, are there any cracks in your exhaust? If there are cracks in your exhaust near that cabin heat shroud, you can get carbon monoxide poisoning. So a lot of small airplanes will have a carbon monoxide detector inside the aircraft for that reason. So that's just a little bit more about induction systems. All right, so mixture. Most airplanes will have a red lever, and that controls the mixture. How much fuel is going to the engine? This is actually how we shut off the engine. We don't switch it off like you do with your car. We starve it of fuel, and there's a couple reasons for that. We talked about the ignition system. We said we have magnetos. If you think back to the old airplanes, they didn't have a starter. You had to hand prop it. So if you turn the engine over and the magnetos are engaged, if the switch is to both or right or left, or the wires that run from that switch to the engine are broken, because the way it's set up, they use what are called P leads, and basically they short out a magneto so that it doesn't work. And this is done this way so that if the wire breaks, the engine still runs, which is the preferred thing if you're in the air. So anyway, we starve it of fuel. That way, if somebody had a hot magneto and someone turned the engine by hand, it's less likely to fire and hurt you really badly sometimes. I know a guy that got thrown 50 feet because his big radial engine, he had the mags on and he was talking to somebody and he got distracted. He turned it over and it fired and it shattered his thigh. And he had to get a lot of surgery to fix that. It was a really bad thing for him. So Mixture control controls how much fuel is going to the engine. So, why do we have this? Why isn't it automatic? Well, as you go up, the air gets thinner. So if I don't decrease the fuel going in, I'm going to have too much fuel. Well, why is that bad? Well, number one, if I have too much fuel going in, I'm wasting money. I have unspent fuel that's going out of my engine. So that's bad to waste money. It's going to reduce my range, and it's actually not good for my engine. I will also have less power. I want to have, a nice efficient power setting, a nice efficient mixture of fuel and air going into my engine. So that's where using the mixture comes in. So I already said, you shut off the engine, you pull the mixture back to idle cutoff. You pull it all the way out and the engine dies. When we start the engine, depending on the engine, you might do it full rich. If it's fuel injected, sometimes you advance it to rich as it starts, but that's a little minor point. It depends on the aircraft, and of course there'll be a checklist in your aircraft that tells you what to do. All right, so we can't talk about mixture without talking about lean. So it's important that you lean properly. How do you lean an engine? Well, there are a couple of different ways. One of the simplest ways is looking at max RPMs. You say, all right, I'm going to pull back the mixture until the RPMs peak, if it's a fixed pitch propeller, which probably is on your training aircraft, and then starts to drop. And then I put it back in a little bit. Max RPMs equals max power. So that's a common way. Another way is to look at EGT, exhaust gas temperature. You pull the mixture out until you see a peak, and then sometimes people say you're going to run it so much rich of peak or lean of peak. Usually rich of peak, but again, consult your aircraft manual. So you pull it out, the exhaust gas temperature peaks, and then you push it back in, and you'll see that it goes down maybe 50 degrees on the temperature gauge. And then you say, okay, that's the way I'm going to go. Some of the Pipers are a lot easier than this. They actually have a chart. And it says, if you want to run at 75% power, here's what you do. You're going to set it this RPMs, at this altitude, and this much fuel flow, and you're done. Right? So it really depends on the aircraft, but I just wanted to make a couple of important points. Sometimes you'll hear pilots say crazy things like, never lean below 3,000 feet. You should always lean if you're in cruise. Now, when we're climbing, we are extra rich, and there's a reason for that. The unspent fuel cools the engine. So we want to cool that engine as we're climbing. We don't have great airflow over the engine. So for those reasons, we will keep it rich. If it's an extended climb, at a cruise climb setting, we might start to lean it out a little bit. But normally, during cruise, any altitude, you're going to lean the mixture. I think part of the reason for this, fake story, whatever you want to call it, about never lean below 3,000 feet comes from the procedures for takeoff. So if you look at the takeoff procedure in most planes, they'll say, if your density altitude is 3,000 feet or higher, then lean for max RPMs before you take off. If it's not, just leave it rich. Right? So that is because they normally want the extra cooling, but if you're at a high density altitude situation, and you don't know what that means yet, but basically low performance situation, you want to get all the power out of the engine you can get. So in that case, you're going to actually lean to get the maximum power for your takeoff. So that is a little bit about mixture. All right, let's talk a little bit about fuel systems. So first of all, let's talk about fuel in general. Most airplanes today are going to run 100 low lead fuel, which is blue in color. Some of the older ones might say that they can also take 80 octane aviation fuel. You can't buy this anymore. This is red, but you can't buy it. And then there's jet fuel. So we're not going to be putting jet fuel in most of our trainers. We're going to be putting in 100 low lead. Some of them will have an STC that says, I can run auto gas in this aircraft as well. An STC is a standard, a supplemental type certificate, which is permission to alter an aircraft. So this is something you can buy if you're an aircraft owner. You can buy it from the EAA, the Experimental Aircraft Association, and then they will give you some placards, and you essentially have permission to save a little bit of money on gas. Right? And there's some reasons you might want to do that, and some reasons you wouldn't. Okay, so if you look at a high wing plane, typically you got your fuel tanks in the wings. And then the fuel runs downhill into your engine. So every engine is going to have an engine-driven fuel pump, just because. A lot of the high wings, like the Cessnas, unless they're fuel injected, don't have another fuel pump. They just rely on an engine-driven fuel pump. If I look at a low wing plane, like most Pipers, the fuel tanks are in the wings, and now this fuel has to go uphill to get to my engine. So for those aircraft, there's normally an electric fuel pump on top of the engine-driven fuel pump. So that allows me to get engine fuel all the time. And that's a good thing. So when I take off and land in my Piper, I'm going to turn on that fuel pump. If it's a Cessna, if it even has an electric fuel pump, I'm only going to use that to prime the engine for starting typically. So that is a little bit about fuel systems. All right, a little bit about oil. Aircraft oil systems are either dry sump or wet sump systems. What's the difference? Basically, a wet sump system, you've got oil in the bottom of the engine and things splash around in that. So I shouldn't say all, many of the Continental engines are wet sump systems. Some of the experimental engines, like the Rotaxes, tend to be dry sump. Right? And when it comes to oil, you can get multi-viscosity oil, you can get straight weight oil. Biggest advantage of multi-viscosity oil is if you have an airplane that's going to be run in the winter and you don't have access to an engine heater, then the multi-viscosity oil can make it a little bit easier to start. If that's not really an issue for you, the straight weight oil works just fine. If you want to start an argument with some mechanics, start talking about which one's better, straight weight or multi-viscosity oil. A lot of times people have really strong opinions on that. If you ask the people that make the oil and people that make engines, they'll tell you it doesn't really matter. Just buy whatever you want. If you go to Phillips and say, hey, why do you make two different kinds of oil? And they said, because people buy it. All right, fair enough. So, as we mentioned during the pre-flights in a previous video, your engine can run at half of its max capacity. By regulation, it has to be possible. Actually, the Piper Lance that I did a pre-flight on the other day, it will run at much less than half its max. So its max is 12, and it will actually operate down to like 3.5 quarts, something ridiculous like that. I don't recommend you do that, but you can. And other things about oil, by the way, in aircraft engines, they all use oil. And the reason for that is the gaps are much wider. Because it's an air-cooled engine, you can't have tight tolerances and your pistons and everything else. So there has to be a little bit more slop, so some of that oil will get into the cylinder and get burned. So they always use oil. If it's a lot of oil, it's a concern. If you've overfilled them with oil, they have a breather tube. So every engine has its happy place for oil. And if you put too much oil in your engine above its happy place, it might be 4.5 quarts or 5.5 quarts, it just blows it out this breather tube, puts it on the belly. So if you look at the belly of many airplanes, especially those that are operated as rentals or in flight schools where people just don't care, they will overfill the oil and the belly is just black because all that stuff gets blown out the bottom. Incidentally, if you don't change your oil regularly, then it will start consuming more oil. Some engines, like our old Cessna in the club here, don't have an oil filter, and that oil has to get changed every 25 hours. If you go past that, it doesn't matter how much oil you throw in there, the stuff in the bottom turns to tar, basically, and all the good oil that you just dumped in there just blows right out. So you have to change your oil regularly if you want your engine to run properly. And of course, you should use the right grade oil, which is in your manual for your aircraft as well. Oil is essential not just for lubrication, but also for cooling. We have air-cooled engines, and it's important that the cowling is correct and all the baffling is correct, so the air is getting directed properly across all the cylinders and they're all getting cooled effectively. But the oil is another big factor as well. Propellers. You're probably going to have a fixed pitch propeller on your training aircraft. What does that mean? That means it's just a solid chunk of wood, composite, or metal that spins. However, if you start to fly more higher performance aircraft, you might have a constant speed propeller. So the second greatest invention in aviation was actually the constant speed propeller. So what does this do for you? This allows you to set a propeller RPM, and you can up the throttle and it will adjust the pitch of the propeller to give you whatever RPMs you desired. So this allows you to essentially have a cruise prop and a climb prop. So sometimes if you look at a fixed prop, people will say, oh, that plane has a cruise prop. No, that one has a climb prop. What does that mean? It means that it's optimized for one or the other. Well, a constant speed prop is optimized for everything. It's like having a transmission, but it's a transmission that has an infinite number of gears. So it's pretty cool. So I'm going to try to describe how this works, and I apologize that my diagram here is pretty poor. So what you have is this little device, this governor, that rotates. It's being spun by the engine. So I have these two little arms that are on pivots here, and as this thing spins faster, those little arms go out. As they go out, they lift up on this little part here, and this is connected to a valve. And what this valve will do is it will send oil to the propeller to change the pitch. So if I want to drive it to lower RPMs, I have to up the pitch so that it's harder to spin that prop. So what happens is it's spinning too fast and these start to go out. that opens this valve, it sends oil to the prop, increases the pitch, and now it's like, ooh, it's too hard to turn it, and the RPMs go down. RPMs go down, and then these go back in, valve closes, and everything's good. So how do you affect the equilibrium point for this system? It's very easy. There's a usually blue lever in the cockpit, that's the prop lever, and it adjusts the tension on a spring. So there's a little spring here, and as I change the prop lever, it adjusts the tension on the spring, which sets that equilibrium point where these things are gonna go in and out. And it's that simple, really. It's a beautiful thing. If you get a chance to fly a higher performance aircraft with one of these, you're gonna like it. A lot of people think, oh, I've got this lever, I'm gonna be moving it all the time. And the answer is actually no. You pretty much are gonna set it at a couple points during your flight and just leave it. You know, you're gonna move it the most when you test it before you take off. So that is a variable pitch or constant speed propeller. And that brings us to the end of chapter 3.